Right. Thank you very much for coming on this very inhospitable evening. It's my great pleasure to welcome James Miller here, who's come from all the way across the water to tell us about engineering, conservation engineering, and what makes it different. James has had a long and very illustrious career. Started designing light rail systems, was a partner at Giffords, led the Cultural Heritage Division at Ramball, and is still an active consulting engineer in the heritage sector. He's currently chair of the KR Accreditation panel, and he's going to give you what I know is going to be a very fascinating lecture. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to James.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, thank you indeed for welcoming me, and I'm delighted to be here. And I think we're all mindful of the fact that actually we have a webcast at the moment as well, and there's a camera up there. So if you are listening on the camera, I'm sorry about Hurricane Lorenzo, which may have stopped you from coming. And I think we all get edited at the end to provide a fine program for those who want to download as a podcast. Thank you very much. The subject that we put before us this evening is as the title there. Conservation engineering, what is it and what makes it different? And I would like to start by asking you to look in the mirror and ask yourself questions about what it is. And this includes all of you who we've been sitting at committee meetings and I've been enjoying the day with today. Please could you ask yourself, what is it about conservation engineering that makes it special? When we look at our projects, what elements are there that are or are not conservation? Here we have Coal Drops Yard at King's Cross, just in the north of London. And it's a Grade 2 listed, protected structure, Grade 2 listed structure in England. A very fine piece of, if you like, industrial railway archaeology that was sitting there and mouldering. Thomas Heatherwick, the architect, Arups, the engineer, abandoned for many years. And now it's stitched up like a kipper with 10,000 pieces of steel. Is that conservation engineering? It's a rhetorical question. And here we are. I've stolen the image, and my apologies if you're from Punch Consulting, because I nicked that off a website. And I was enjoying a coffee today in the building. The National Gallery in Dublin, a remarkable extension to a very fine building. Are we looking at heavy conservation? We see in front of us heavy engineering flanking historic fabric. Or is it the inspection and specification and repair of the ruins of our past? You might here at Tulsk Priory, Roscommon, look at it and think that some might argue it amounts to just careful gardening. And what about that extremely dodgy gable there? How do you say, as an engineer, that that is stable? Or is it, we might ask ourselves, is it a question open? Maybe, maybe not. Is it the total demolition and reconstruction in facsimile of a stunning landmark bridge? We recreate in almost every detail something, a value of the past, but that is completely new. We're engaging here in conservation philosophy. We're asking ourselves, what is it? What's the essence of all of these that really matters? And are they conservation or not? Is it, extending out a little further and dwelling on this for a moment, is it a complex piece of analysis? Something that takes our techies, our technical side, deep, deep, deep into our analytical programs. Not a building, just repairing. And here we have the simple undertaking, but of a major laser scan, a huge laser scan of great accuracy, followed by solid modelling. Solid modelling leading to advanced nonlinear analysis of iron. Iron smelted 240 years ago, the properties of which, are we guessing? How are we apportioning those properties? Or lastly, in question, is it not even being an engineer at all? Not the engineer you learnt to be at university, or the engineer you learnt to be when you were chartered, but instead becoming a historian, researching, doing desk study, delving into physical archives and understanding how the whole thing was put together, and then creating, in effect, a gazetteer, a diary running to several pages that looks at the development of an internationally significant bridge, the Ironbridge, Shropshire, the first iron bridge in the world. Which of these and which elements are conservation engineering? That is a rhetorical question, and we can come back to it in question time. But you need to ask yourself, because you need to approach this matter from the point of view of your philosophy and where you engage. I'm going to leave that as it stands for a moment. Having asked you to kick it about, I now ask you, conservation engineering, whatever is in your mind that might be, can anyone do it? Is it open for anybody to undertake? Well, those who are members of the Institution of Structural Engineers may remember a column in the journal The Structural Engineer, run between January 2014 and June 2015, of 19 articles. And those, in actual fact, were articles that we sat down and I volunteered. I said, look, I'd like to run this column. And I edited it for that period. I wasn't author of all of them, but I edited it on the way through. Quite a task. It was well worthwhile, and it had pretty good response to it. The first question that I asked in the opening article was, can any engineer do it? And I read, if you'll forgive me, before looking in more detail at the modern conservation movement, which I do in that article, it's worth reflecting on the goals. Can any structural engineer engage in historic work, that is, work on buildings protected by heritage legislation? And in a sense, the answer is yes. Certainly, right? Rather like we engineers turn ourselves to facade engineering or fire engineering or become specialists in computational fluid dynamics. We, who are conservation accredited, all started out our life in general practice. And perhaps that's where you are. Perhaps you have started through your degrees, through your general practice background, but it's drawing you in I had a colleague who said to me when I went along, who was a skeptic, and there may be many you encounter who are skeptics. I take it actually that you're here this evening on a really miserable evening, that you are not skeptics. But he said to me, anyone can do it, in a disparaging way. And I went away slightly fuming, and I came back to him and I slapped it on the table, my care certificate. I said, I've got one of these, where's yours? Which was a bit of an angry reaction. But it is true. What we're going to look at in a little later on is going to be the Conservation Accreditation process. I've got one of these. John's got one of these. John Kelly sitting down here. Where's yours, we might say. And I know a lot of you want one. And we're going to describe what it is and what it is not to be accredited. So I hope by the time we get to the end, I will have answered some of those questions. Can anyone do it? Yes, you can. But you have come into a position of where your passion for history has driven you into higher skills. Passion is essential, and it will drive you to work on some amazing buildings and in turn to seek accreditation. But some will say it's all subjective. And recently we had an application from someone who said just that. You do what you feel is right. I have news for you. There's almost as much documentation about the international principles of conservation practice as there is about concrete design. And here in front of us, here's where it kicks off in the British Isles. And here we have in the room two SPAB scholars, both of whom who are smiling from ear to ear in front of me at the moment. So here is one of our heroes. Is he a hero, William Morris? I don't know. Born out of the philosophies that John Ruskin brought through in thinking in the middle of the 19th century, William Morris and others with him went on to found SPAB, horrified by the facelifting of, in particular, churches by modern movements at the time. He came out with he was a great polemicist. He was a great arguer in political realms as well as with buildings, if you look at his biography. But he argued his way. He said, and he was going to win because the public were with him. This tremendous phrase, that actually to put protection at the place of restoration, to stave off decay by daily care, to prop a perilous wall or mend a leaky roof by such means as are obviously meant for support or covering. And they're words that actually our SPAB scholars could quote verbatim because it's drummed in, it's there. And what's the meaning for the engineer? The meaning of this is that we maintain things. We don't knock them down and build them new. That's exactly what these words say. And we have, I believe, actually it cropped up in our day's discussion, we have SPAB Repair Day, Maintenance Day? Maintenance Week. Maintenance Week coming up next week.
No, the end of November.
End of November, thank you. Thank you. Okay. A very much part of the philosophy of how we look after our built heritage. Doesn't stop there, of course it doesn't. And I have a few slides that take us through this very important area. It's all subjective, isn't it? No, it's not all subjective. Here we are at the roots in the 20th century, the Athens Charter. At this time, there is no ICOMOS. Athens Charter was organised by the International Museums Office in the early 30s. and held a conference to discuss how we look after our heritage. And I draw your attention to a couple of these clauses. 1931, the conference recommends that in the construction of buildings, the character and external aspect of the cities in which they're erected, should be respected. We're respecting the setting. It's not just the building, we're respecting the setting, something that goes into our modern planning legislation. Below that, the conference noted that in the conditions of present-day life, monuments throughout the world were being threatened by an ever-increasing degree of atmospheric agents. This is 1931. And how far we've come on from that in 90 years. Indeed, it's ever increasing degree of atmospheric agents. If it was true then, it certainly is true today. The little phrase down below I just love, and it will bring a smile to us. The experts heard various communications concerning the use of modern materials for the consolidation of ancient monuments. They approved the judicious use of all resources at the disposal of modern technique, and more especially of reinforced concrete. Laughs in the auditorium. And it is there you see the warning for us in this current generation, that our techniques of repair that we think are so good now have to find durability. Because if there's any criticism we can level at our previous techniques, past techniques, the number one is durability. I would say if you were in Italy, the number two is seismic. Because you don't put heavy reinforced concrete at the top of church towers when you're dealing with horizontal accelerations. Understanding our structures is very important when we engage in repair. Athens, Venice Charter, 1964. Venice Charter came out of Athens, interrupted by the Second World War, and Venice led directly to the formation of the International Council on Monuments and Sites, known as ICOMOS. ICOMOS, which has tremendous presence and is the most important body in overseeing our principles of conservation philosophy across the world. Venice was a very important conference. It sought to expand the boundaries over which the people and conservation were working. However, I think it's important to remember and reflect on, as you look down the list of signatories, I think there were 27, that only 3 of them were from outside Europe. And this is still a very Europe-centric profession. There was a problem with that. There was a problem. The wording, although we had started to use the words buildings and sites, monuments and sites, we essentially were still dealing with man-made creations, the heritage that we have fashioned ourselves. Those in Australia and in other countries had a problem with that. Many of the historic sites, for example in Australia, they are places sacred to Aboriginal use. And those like Uluru in the centre have no fashioning by human hand. These are not monuments or sites in the way we understand the Parthenon. These are simply places. And what came about in the Borough Charter, 1977 Australia ICOMOS, what came about was a new word that entered our language, a very, like many beguiling things, a very simple word. And instead of building or site, we have the word place. And the word place enters our vocabulary as conservation professionals. And through this, I find this very, very interesting, almost exciting, really, because what we see in the taking up of the word place, we see a translation into contemporary architecture. And I haven't traced it all the way back, but for me, this is the root of the phrase placemaking in modern architecture. It goes back to the Borough Charter, who would not stick with monuments and sites, but saw place, the word place, placemaking. What we're doing when we're placemaking in modern architecture is we are seeking to echo the very best of the past. The memories we've created in the past, we're seeking to translate them in new forms as architects and urban planners struggle to create places of identity for our future communities. And that word place then translates itself, of course, into our national documentation. And here I have an extract, forgive me, we're in Ireland, extract from Historic England's document, Conservation Principles. Places of cultural significance should be conserved. 2.3, conservation is an integral part of good management of places of cultural significance. Places of cultural significance should be safeguarded and not put at risk or left in a vulnerable state. And for those of you who like codes and guidance, there's even a British standard for those of us who carry British standards. BS 7913 is the guide to the principles of conservation in historic buildings. In summary, this is a code. This is BS 8110, EC2, EC3. This is a standard for conserving historic buildings. So, this is for real. This discipline of conservation engineering isn't make it up as you go along. This is based on international charters and standards that is going back at least 90 years, but really the roots of the modern conservation movement lie in philosophy in the 19th century. Let's embrace them and read them and pick them up and find our roots, our own roots in these, as we look in the mirror and understand the structures that we look at. How do these apply to those? So, let's look at some project examples. And I have a couple of longer ones and three short fire ones. Westminster Hall, right at the heart of the Palace of Westminster. And forgive me a throwaway remark, currently the seat of an awful lot of hot air. Here we are in a reinterpretation of the way in which people pass through the building. So they used to rise through a horrible little array of security scanners on St. Stephen's Gate St. Stephen's entrance, and rise up the public when they were admitted and through to the central lobby, completely skirting Westminster Hall, which essentially is the size of 4 tennis courts, and was built by William Rufus in around 1095. And the public are missing out on this. So the new visitor reception building was built to direct them down scanners, security, and then pass in on the north entrance of the hall to bring them through an extraordinary building. Here we have it with the visitor reception building half completed, and a view along the south steps. You see a dip there of 9 inches, 225 millimetres or thereabouts. And comments have been made. I understand we were guided to, when I won the job, that Her Majesty had made a comment about the settlement on the floor. But in particular, there were a couple of old ladies, I'm told, who were wandering around. And because, of course, when things settle, the huge slabs that line the floor were dipping, and they lip that whole thing when one sticks up above another, lipping by up to an inch, 25 mil. There were a couple of occasions where old ladies fell over and there was blood. Well, this is not acceptable, and this building is now not really fit for purpose. We have to do something about it. This is a big decision. A building of this age, a UNESCO set in a World Heritage Site, a Grade 1 listed building and scheduled monument, the oldest building in the history of world parliamentary democracy, and we won't get on to other subjects just now. This is a threat, and when you have heritage at risk, you have to act or make decisions that inform action. So the task here is to diagnose. And I say that because one of the most important lessons, I think, out of this project, in 2005, we sought to diagnose the cause of settlement, and in 2006, we sought to put it right. The most important thing here is to focus on the fact we were looking for a full and complete diagnosis, because we have a building of immense value, historic value. No one in their right mind should let me go near it and start to dismantle large parts of it to put it right, unless I have persuaded them that I have a solution that is based on fact, on a correct diagnosis and a correct solution. I shouldn't be let near it. So this is what we are doing. We are diagnosing. And you can translate that to any of your projects, that you need to achieve a correct diagnosis and not just cross your fingers and hope your solution will work. Maybe it's the best you can do. But if you are concerned that you haven't achieved a correct diagnosis, go off and chat to a colleague. Make sure that you've got the very best in terms of your data and solutions. Here we are, by suction lifting methods, lifting a slab that is 1.6 metres square and 75 mil thick. Each one of 500 of them weighs 3/4 of a tonne. We're lifting them by suction lifting to see what's underneath. We're going through with a coring tool under each of 10 locations, having designed an investigation. So we haven't got on to designing the solution. We have designed an investigation, set that investigation down in a document, had it reviewed, and seen whether this investigation we're proposing is going to achieve good results. 2 cores down under each of 10 locations, very carefully chosen. A 1 core hole to push down a probe. That's a core through a lime concrete slab 1 foot thick, and to push down a probe for a thin-walled archaeological sampling, and the other to push down a probe for engineering properties. We have a purpose-designed rig with a hand-delivered Kentledge, 4 tons of it, manhandled to each new location, with an immediate printout of the ground conditions as we go down. And we have a very clear and positive diagnosis at the end of that. We have 8 locations over the settlement, the region of settlement, and 2 locations chosen, if you like, placebos, away from the area of settlement. And we find a layer of organic peat varying in depth from 1 to 3 metres on the banks of the Thames, underlying those areas of fabric that are settling, and that peat is not present in the locations where they haven't settled. We have a diagnosis, and we take that forward with a pause into our solution. And our solution is to dismantle the floor selectively. We have to decide how far we're going around the edges. We dismantle the floor and take it off. Each of those elements that we've dismantled is of great value, historic value. It goes off to bonded warehouse under lock and key. These aren't granite sets by the road to be nicked by the first passing lorry. This has to be looked after. We engage in archaeology with two major archaeological pits going down, one of which you can see just to the left of the statue. Slabs lifted, archaeology, the steps, the south steps on which Barack Obama stood to address both houses of Commons and Lords. Nelson Mandela addressed the houses. These are the steps that had been reconstructed by the time those addresses were delivered. And although you'd be forgiven for thinking this is not particularly sensitive with all that plant, this is it, basically. This is a solution. This is a very thick porridge that is being injected under high pressure, very, very slowly building essentially to piles within the ground. High control over the depth of compaction that we're achieving out into the organic clay at precisely the level we want. Compaction grouting, none of this low viscosity fracture grouting that would have been dreadful in this location. This is a highly controlled system on the same grid as the slabs. We have our solution, we enact our solution, and by the time we've finished, we walk away from the hall, and essentially you'd be forgiven for thinking that anyone had been there at all. I think I once did a quote for a piece of marketing material that, I think actually I borrowed this from someone else. Engineers engaged in conservation should take only photos and leave only footprints. And the mark of a conservation engineer is to work on a historic building and leave no trace. And that isn't true of everything we do. I work on a lot of new buildings as well, but nevertheless, it is one of the marks there that we're considering. Temperate House at Kew Gardens, which was opened last year, and I looked after the project for Ramboll as lead consultant. There was a project manager and a project manager within Kew, but I looked after it for about 2.5 years until I made a company move, trying to slow down a bit. I'm not sure I've achieved that very much, but it had last been restored in the late 1970s. The Temperate House is the largest iron glass house in the world. Emphasis on the word iron. And this was, I think, the fourth or fifth time since it was the larger part of it was completed in around 1860 that it had been restored. The glass had become etched with deposits and was failing in places, and the paint was largely off the ironwork. It's a Grade 1 listed building, the highest category in the UK, in England. So how do we find out about these things? Well, the first thing you need to do when you go in is survey, a common theme. We need to understand our structures, and this very significant building needs to be understood. And rather like lifting our slabs, there is no way out. If you need to understand your building, you need to get close to it. And you have to be bold in saying, I need a big cherry picker. I need a big access platform. And this one, in terms of horizontal lift, was one of the biggest. So they were stuck on the end of an arm out at 35 metres width, horizontal distance from our point of pivot at times. We were up over the roof and down the sides and everything. And we also had access platforms inside the building. We have to understand it from all angles. Otherwise, how do you put the cost plan together? What's it going to be costed on, apart from anything else? Another tool at our disposal these days, of course, is the scanner. More and more so, and drone and LiDAR, but terrestrial, of course, is the original and best. we can record detail, and we can record it to a tremendous degree. But in the case of the Temperate House, especially, one thing you can miss is it gives us control over geometry. And by that I mean we're about to enact a major project on this. Two things. Is it deformed before we start? Because some parts of this are working like a portal, and how much does that deflect the columns outwards? You get halfway through a project, and this is a long project, 2.5, 3 years, and someone says, I've just put a plumb line down this and it's 85mm out of plumb. And you think, oh dear. Well, if you haven't got a baseline to work from, and it was 80mm out plumb to start with, then how do you know? So it's giving us control over our geometry in all ways. So you're understanding the deformations before you start, and you're understanding the deformations as you take dead load off the structure as well. And if you're taking parts out of it, it gives you control over their position when you put them back as well. Laser scanning is incredibly powerful and stands alongside all other tools, but probably is for major structures is essential, and I think we all realise that. In many of our historic buildings, there are either unique elements or elements that are unfamiliar to the modern engineer. And here we are looking at all the rafter beams on the main block of the Temperate House, and we have here, look at that. You are indeed looking at a four flanges on a wrought iron section, are rolled this deep. And you'll say, well, the answer's simple. Well, you'll say, why are those there? Because the middle ones aren't contributing to strength. No, the general idea when it was built was it had wooden casements that ran up and down in these four flanges. I regret to say and report that Builder magazine reported that these locked up as they skewed in their runners, just like a drawer would skew as you pulled it in and out, and it never really worked terribly well, but it was a nice idea. But there you have unique elements on a grade 1 listed. We are on site, and a major project like this needs a clerk of works, and there he is. So we have a full-time clerk of works, a luxury that you don't always have. We had it. Questions that you may find arising during the project may be unfamiliar if you're just used to a normal paint job on a modern steel bridge. What about the filling of all those casting defects on the left? Have you allowed for that in the specification? And assessment of significance of corrosion. It isn't unusual on minor elements to accept at least half the section being lost and take the structure forward with that, because they're not critical to the overall stability. They're secondary elements, but you need to know your mind on it. These are questions that you will need to have addressed in your mind before you go further, and will arise during inspection. And here we have with the beautiful completed Temperate House, and I could tell you a lot of other stories about that along the way, but let's move on for the moment. Briefly, 3 other examples, and I look at the clock and see I'm going a little slowly. I might hurry through some of these. 3 other examples. First of them is the Lovell Telescope, or Jodrell Bank, a grade 1 listed structure. What keeps this going? Because in other philosophical ramblings, I love to reflect on single-use structures, what I call single-use structures, things that are not easily converted. I don't think you can convert Jodrell Bank to another use. And it is still used by the University of Manchester to study pulsars in the far reaches of our galaxy, which is why it still lives. It is a living structure, not a dead one, not an artifact. It has a life. That's hugely important for it. Grade 1 listed 1957, Husband and Company, a dreadful piling system underneath the running rails on the outside, but essentially looking at it with regard to doing a paint job. And simply to say that on a structure that big, you can see from the photo on the right, just you're going to want to invest a lot of time and effort in the dissection of a simple question. Does it need to be repainted now or later? You're going to invest yourself very heavily. I'd suggest something that civil engineers are slightly better at than structural engineers. Civil engineers love to go off and analyse a problem in great detail, whereas structural engineers simply want to go up to the mountain and come back on the same day. In passing, actually, I love photography. And the image on the right won me 200 quid in a photographic competition. We go off to the North Arabian Desert, and we're looking at here a typology in architecture. If you go to the UAE, you will see modern structures with these rotunda on the sides, huge or small, but essentially an architectural element. And here's where it's borrowed from. It's from the 19th century mud watchtowers, from which they guarded by rifle the waterhole oases in the desert. And there are very few surviving, and this is one of them. What can you offer as an engineer in this case? It's mud, it's small. I came home, my wife said, "You went all that way to look at that heap of stones?" And here we are. What can we offer? We can offer a cool head as engineers, sound philosophy, our ability to discuss and tease out solutions, and an understanding of the materials and the mechanics of failure. And together we can put those together in very simple solutions. And lastly, of my quick-fire examples, is the President's House in Trinidad. And you can see there was a period where I was really rather enjoying myself. 2009 or 10, I forget, I travelled to Trinidad for a week to do a condition survey, inspection of this colonial age building from about 1874. The president actually had moved out. I was surveying basically an L-shape, a very substantial L-shaped building in the Trinidadian environment, hot, humid, solid rain for 2 hours every day, and then simpering sun. But also taken essentially the same week as that photo. Here is a view of the ballroom wing. And whilst doing a condition survey, I was also asked to postulate on the causes of collapse of the ballroom wing, which occurred 2 weeks after a modest earthquake of 4.5 on the Richter scale. 2 weeks after. And obviously, I'm at that moment taking that photo not from a drone, but from the extended arm of a cherry picker, the tallest in Trinidad, which we use to work over the whole roof as well. And here we are, understanding our materials, our forms of construction, looking deep into that debris. And indeed, I learnt a lot of lessons out of that. Finally, on Trinidad, whilst there, I was confronted with what I would describe, and the SPAB scholars will be intrigued by this, but what I would say were the roots of our modern conservation movement. I think it's still true, but I'm not sure. When I was there was no heritage protection legislation. And so the colonial buildings, which had gone through the psyche of the Republic, in Trinidad and Tobago, as a product of a problematic past, had now come in and been loved. And yet there was nothing protecting them. They were falling to pieces and they were being demolished. And overnight, in the dark, people would come out and pin signs on the fence. Seek beauty and truth. Help, says one. The people of Port of Spain do not want their buildings taken down. And to me, those are roots of what we had in Spab. Let's pause for a moment. And we're going to go through some written slides. Forgive me for, I think we're running on probably another 10 or 15 minutes, if that's okay with you. Because we're going to go in the direction of care. Having looked at some examples, I've got a series of slides on what it is to be accredited. And then I'm going to just say what I don't think accreditation is, and then we will conclude with what it takes deep inside us to become accredited engineers. Here we are. This is the nuts and bolts. Have you got a passion for it? Well, early in my career, I didn't want to be pigeonholed. I realised at the age of 30, however, as I was given licence and a pass to go around the Greenwich Naval Colleges with Corinne Bennett of Purcell at the time and inspect Sir Christopher Wren's amazing complex there, I realised that actually this is where I was going to come home to at the age of 30. But it wasn't until I was about 45 until I was accredited. Where are you coming from? Who is eligible? A wide range of people are eligible, but the essence is that you must be recognised by your profession in your own country to become an accredited engineer, conservation accredited. It is, in effect, a higher level of assessment and skill than your chartership. Together with CARE, what we are aiming to do is to drive standard and consistency and drive up the level to which we look after our historic buildings. How does it all function? I'm going to jump on a slide there. How does it all function? We have volunteer members. There's myself here. There's John, Kelly, Ivor there, who's been a tremendous supporter. And we have a panel that meets twice yearly. We have an annual meeting at which we have have 3 talks and discussion, and of course we look after the assessment process. And as we grow, currently being around 69 members on the full register across Engineers Ireland, the Institution of Structural Engineers, and the ICE, as we grow, we are finding more roles on the panel: education and training, leading assessment, looking at our web presence. So that's what happens. That's the nuts and bolts of CARE. But here is the meat, as far as you're concerned. If you want to become accredited, this is the meat of it. The principles on which we base our assessment are levelled across the whole of the conservation profession, and they are levelled by ICOMOS guidelines for education and training, which establish these principal attributes. You must understand significance, cultural significance. You must understand aesthetic qualities and values. You, as an engineer, will probably be well versed in investigation, materials and technology. You've got to get your money and your social financial issues right, and you do have to display an element of management and your ability to manage works on site, all across your case studies on conservation. That's the basis. That's where it comes from. It's not made up. It's across all disciplines, all professions. I threw in this slide because I love the Segovia Aqueduct. And you ask yourself, it'll drive you in becoming conservation accredited. It'll drive you to ask philosophical questions like, what is the function of mortar? Mortar. Because there isn't any in that aqueduct. What is the function of mortar then? And then it'll drive you to obviously, and I think here in Ireland you are better served than perhaps us in England, because much of your built heritage is stone. We have many more timber buildings, and we were discussing this earlier. Lime. I think our engineers in England are not good at understanding lime. You will need to understand your limes very well here in Ireland if you're to get past the assessors. And that must become part of your DNA. How do you go through it? Well, you pay your application fee. That's some money there. Sorry, guys. There's an application form. This is largely administered by the ICE, who offer us great support. So I'm sorry, but that's actually where the centre of gravity lies. And we have almost a quarter-time secretariat who helps us, paid guys, Michael, for which we're very grateful. You have to put your CV together, which is obviously going to be conservation biased. You're going to put a 500-word conservation philosophy together. And frankly, if you don't mention any of the documents that I quoted earlier, you're not going to come out terribly well. But that's a bit of a hint. But again, this is not made up stuff. This is there to be read. You're going to put your CPD records in order, which might put the fear into the heart of some people. But you're going to also, most importantly, you will have had your 5 case studies that essentially are your life experience, your experience as an engineer that you have built up. And they don't have to be big. You could put in, say, the restoration of 2 or 3 chimneys, significant chimneys, on an important building as one case study. And a number of others. And our wording is across a number of forms of construction and a number of materials. And I venture to say that if you put in 5 case studies all about the restoration of ruins, then that wouldn't be seen as good as putting 3 case studies about ruins and 2 about other buildings. Do you get my drift? That's the kind of balance. We're not insisting people go for everything just because I've shown you Ironbridge, but you do have to have a range. And there's an interview. You go through a check, 2 assessors who are looking at 2 engineering assessors and 1 independent architect or surveyor who look at your submission. And then, provided all's okay, you'll go forward to interview, which can be by Skype. And that's particularly relevant perhaps for those of you here in Ireland. And a comment was made earlier, and I said I would say something on this. We have very few care engineers here in Ireland at the moment. And you should not be put off by thinking, I know John, but John, I'm going to be sitting with him, he's going to be my assessor. It doesn't work like that. We have to declare, as assessors, he has to declare whether he knows you or not. And if he does declare interest, it has to be somebody else. Which means here in the case of Ireland, it'll probably be assessors from across the water. Probably. Not necessarily. And we do it by Skype. The biggest thing is your submission. The interview is important, very important, but focus on the submission to start with. And I've just told you most of what's on that slide. You can find out more on the ICE website, which is strongest, but the others will take you there in the end. In conclusion, care is not a little sports certificate, a swimming certificate, something that goes in the drawer after you've learned to swim and is irrelevant and never gets pulled out again. Care is not something that tells you that you belong to a club, that you play golf and enjoy the socialising. That's great, but that's not what care is. Some people think that they're joining the club and thereafter they can just get on and do what they did before. Care is not a ticket that you fork out money for and you exchange it for entry at the gate to the match. That is not what care is. All you do is you purchase and you go in. I think Japan are doing very well. Sorry about that, guys. Care is a predefined, assessed level of ability, knowledge, and competence. It recognises you as a specialist and enables you to practice in that field, and you keep your skills strong. Agatha Christie married an archaeologist, the author Agatha Christie, and she came out with this wonderful phrase. She said, being married to an archaeologist is fantastic. The older I get, the more interested he is in me. Conservation engineers have a passion. We are passionate about our past. Passion is a word, I think, that defines most people who work in this field to some extent. We delight in handling buildings that make our collective memory. We respect things that are old. We have sensitive minds. We create sensitive designs. We aspire to seeing our history passed on to future generations. And we're aware that our buildings and structures must breathe in the present through human touch. They are not stuck in a glass case if they are to outlive us. Thank you. Thank you for listening so patiently. And are there any questions? Okay, so at this point, I pull the drawer to one side as instructed, grab a microphone, hand it to Lisa, and we can. I'm staying in Dublin overnight. We can stay here as long as you like. So I think that's on. I think that.
Yeah, that sounds
on.
like
Yeah.
it's on. Yeah,
Okay.
it is on. Right.
So as long as you like, really. If you want to say your name, that'd be great.
Not a problem. Thanks, James, for that very informative lecture. Actually, it's very good. Kind of coming from my point of view, I've done very little of this conservation work as we discussed prior to the lecture. Just kind of picking up on, Mike Nealon is my name, by the way. Just picking up on one of the things that you said. Kind of conservation engineering is more complex than just new build engineering, and that you're kind of trying to really understand something that exists. Is there ever, you mentioned there in terms of assessing a structure that it might be out of plumb to the order of 85 millimeters or otherwise like that. Is there ever kind of the temptation to put it right? It's got its own kind of natural equilibrium that it's settled to. It's kind of, I've always kind of vaguely understood, of buildings that are 80, 90 years old. If it's cracked kind of thing, it's not going to go any further.
Yeah.
But is there that kind of temptation, like Temperate House?
Yes.
That you would put things right to kind of modern standards? How do you kind of manage that kind of that philosophy?
I think that part of it is there a temptation to put it right? I think actually by the time, and you'll get the feel through what we've been discussing and looking at, by the time you've understood your structures, you get a sense of what you should be doing to them. There's a natural feel of what you should be doing to them. On the whole, what we do when we monitor and find instability, meaning progressive movement, is we endeavour to stabilise things in their current position. If I take an example of a steel frame which should be erected square, and it's erected 200 millimetres out of plumb. And now there are many new architects who design new buildings. I'm thinking of Will Alsop in London, who designed plenty of columns that are a metre out of plumb. So answer the question, can this structure be made stable? Just in this trivial example, the answer is yes, it most certainly can. You're tempted to put it right, but you don't need to. Your client may ask you to put it right because he doesn't like the look of it. But if it's protected by heritage legislation, then you have to answer the question, is there risk to the structure? That's the most important thing. Is there risk? Is this structure at risk? And if the answer is no, you shouldn't be attempting to put anything right. Stabilize it, understand why it's been moving, put steps in place to stabilize it, but don't pull it upright.
It's been kind of in that state of P delta for, it's the length of its design life, or up to now, like I suppose is kind of what you're saying, is it?
I can go off into P delta if you want to, but the principle is that you can design a new structure so that it's not vertical. So why would an existing historic structure necessarily have a problem, as long as you know what the buttressing effects are? And maybe there's an example in the back of your mind that we need to tease out down the pub or something like that. But in my mind, the examples of walls that are out of plumb, you can, as William Morris said, to prop a perilous wall. It's a perilous wall. Let's analyse that phrase. Perilous wall, it's at risk. What action shall we take? Shall we rebuild it or shall we prop it? At the moment, there seem to be two options. There's a third option, do nothing and watch it fall down, or we can monitor. So already I've got four options there. Option analysis is a very important part of understanding how we take historic buildings forward. And which one are we going to do? Well, actually, I think we'll go for the prop. And we get there.
Just one last question before I hand the mic back. Have you ever found yourself during your career in conflict with a client in terms of, your assertion, your passion for conservation engineering when they wanted to knock something, kind of standing ground on your passionate belief to retain a structure, or kind of refurbish a structure, using conservation engineering techniques that you gained during your career?
And the answer is yes. Thankfully, precious few times. But actually, candidly, one or two of our members, our registrants, have occasionally come up and we've discussed instances where they've had clients put pressure on them. And I think the phrase we were discussing the power that lies in our hands as registrants, because people look to engineers in general as those who understand the heartbeat, the throbbing lifeblood of a building. The architect, okay, will replace the stonework and look at the fenestration, but if a building's about to fall down, they look to us to write the letter that says it must be demolished. And here we've got a case where occasionally a client leans on one of our registrants and says, the phrase is, write me a letter that says. And at the moment he says those words come out of their mouth, he is asking you to do something that you should not be doing. You need to make up your mind, and society at large expects us to make up our minds, and the Accreditation Register expects that. And we should not be writing things that we don't think are right. If we think there are options to stabilise a building, we should write that. Have I is the question, and yes, I have. And on the whole, these days, I normally, frankly, because I'm chair of the accreditation panel, I cannot afford to take on projects like that. Most of my projects are quite small scale. I've shown you Ironbridge, but mine are pretty small these days, the majority of them. And occasionally on the phone, and I could quote you some examples, but we go on to long stories then. I've said, I'm sorry, I can't help you. And I've done that. I can think of 2 occasions where I've done that. One in particular is worth a pint and a discussion, but not in front of us here.
Sorry, not a question, but could I just make a comment on that discussion? The odd thing about conservation engineering is that the building is your client. That is your responsibility.
Yeah. Yes.
And
yes,
it's very difficult
yes.
to get clients to understand that.
Yeah.
But that is the fact of the matter.
Yeah.
And one has to keep that in the front of one's mind.
It's generally the legislation that makes building your client.
Well, the legislation helps. But,
yes.
But I mean, in principle, that is the position. But the other thing I might just mention is the question of the interdisciplinary. The interdisciplinary nature of conservation work. It's very important to be involved with all sorts of experts of different types, and the end product is really to fully understand the significance in all respects of a building and a site.
Yes. Yep. Thank you. Okay, if you just say your name, and that's great. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Owen O'Reilly. Just a question in relation to that, looking in the mirror and considering yourself a conservation engineer, and maybe asking yourself whether you have the right attributes or not. Or I just kind of pose a question for you, just in terms of whether you're going to commit conservation heresy or not yourself. I was recently at the opening of a new building that was restored. It's the Newman building on Stephen's Green, and it's used now for the new Museum of Literature of Ireland. But I noticed coming out the door as people were emerging after the culture night that the step had been worn so much because there had been thousands and thousands of students passing through. And I thought it was actually dangerous. I felt that it posed a problem for people moving in and out, and that there would be a mobility issue around it. In a situation like that, I just the thought ran through my mind: should you take the step out and put it in a glass case? Should you replace it with a step that's fairly similar? Do you make it safe? Do you provide an alternative, etc., etc.? And in my mind, I suppose, coming at it from a safety perspective, I probably had a first notion of what I wanted to do. But was I being a conservatist if I was to take the wrong option? And is there such a thing as a wrong option? And how do you push the right option? Right. So the other question, the last part of that is that I'd like to ask you the question as a conservation engineer: what would your option A be?
Yeah. Okay. That to me is I think probably for expediency I'll answer that, but I'd really love to push the microphone to the SPAB scholars on that one. But so you saw you had immediately 4 options there, okay, and I had a 5th, which would be my option, but you immediately had 4, and I would encourage you that any documents we write in relation to any protected structures have options, and the standards are: do nothing. The second one is do nothing and monitor. And those are the first 2 that we go for on everything. But we're looking at risk. And the general perception is that the do nothing is probably, because you've been asked to look at it, isn't an option. But it may be. I look at many buildings and some people are worried about them. I said, oh, that's all right. So that's all right. You talked about a step that's very worn. I think there are a number of ways of approaching it, and actually another thing we could talk about is putting an applied non-slip finish on it, which some people might do down the deep depression, and frankly, between you and me, it'll probably come off quite quickly. I think the normal option, things that you wouldn't do, and you set the whole thing up for it, you wouldn't remove that stone and put it in a glass case. Why would you? And the whole thing of taking elements out and putting them in the corner is pretty much frowned upon, I'd say, because you're removing an object from its proper location in a historic structure, putting it remotely somewhere and saying this is important, and no one knows why it's important. They can't see it in the context of where it is and the thousands of feet that are walked all over it. They've got no idea. You know, an interpretation panel, this was the step that thousands of people walked over. Nonsense. What you probably do is you do an indent, if it was possible, and you will see around the walls of many a historic building where a large piece of building stone has cracked on the corner or weathered very badly in one place, that they'll cut out part of the stone, and the stonemasons are particularly good at this and are practiced at this. They'll cut out part of the stone and replace it with the same material, the same sourcing, and put it back. On a door threshold, if the stone is large enough, you will put an indent in the centre part that has worn. So you will cut it out, and then you match it in on the sides as you can, so that the wearing part is then replaced, and it's deemed as sacrificial. And you will see that on quite a number of steps. If it's become dangerous, rather like the floor of Westminster Hall, then you need to sort it, because the heritage, the protected structure is at risk. This is the main threshold, and it's lost function. It's dangerous, and that's part of conservation. The functionality of being able to use it is part of us conserving our buildings properly. It's not the word you might have seen on the slide. We're not dealing with preservation. Preservation was a big word to us in the UK in the 1980s. And we don't preserve anymore. We do more than that. We conserve. And conserve means that our buildings live into the future. Because if they need to change and adapt slightly, then that's the path we need to adopt. And that's recognised by ICOMOS, and we know it. It becomes second nature. Sorry, I'm talking a lot. Questions? John.
So I think if we've run out of questions, it only remains for me to ask you to say thank you to James in the customary manner. And to encourage you not to procrastinate, but to go home and this weekend start your first case study. There's only 5.
Is there only 5?
So start with the first one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dee.